Hi, I'm Sam, the Wendy's Warrior, and my goal is to maximize decks with niche commanders. The deck I'm going over today is my own personal deck, recently showcased on Land, Dragonhawk, Fate's Tempest. The deck wants to end games with massive chunks of damage when you press the big red button by assembling a 4-for-4 combo. Dragonhawk reads, whenever Dragonhawk enters or attacks, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 4 or greater. You may play those cards until your next end step. At the beginning of your next end step, Dragonhawk deals 2 damage to each opponent for each of those cards that are still exiled. Notably, you do not have to, nor do you want to play these cards. It is a 5/5 flying for 5, but again, the most relevant part is that line about the damage. You're going to be nuking your opponent's faces every time you enter or attack with Dragonhawk. Now let's get the boring standard stuff out of the way. For your mono reds, you have mandatory protection and ramp you must run. You need Deflecting Swan and Bulk Bend for protection. It's nearly free. You should use it. You need to protect your commander. It's the linchpin of the entire deck. It's almost a useless pile of 4/4s without it. Secondly, you have the rank. Ruby Medallion, Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, and Wayfarer's Bauble. Lastly, I run Mindstone in my build. I just kind of like it as a glue card that both ramps you and is card draw later on. Plus Jessica's Will for a higher budget. Outside of the typical stuff, you have Runaway Steamkin, which will give you a counter on itself every time you cast a red spell, which is nearly all your spells, and you can remove these counters to add 3 red mana, which helps you ramp. But until then, it's a 4/4 sitting on your battlefield to help your commander. Cursed Mirror will let you re-trigger ETB such to your commanders. You can sacrifice the mirror if you want, or you can use another creature that's not going to die the legend roll. Path of the Hammer is nice because he makes a 4/4 every turn. This also untaps a land. Or you can add red for each mountain you control late game for a huge surge in mana. His ultimate doesn't really matter, but it is there as a nice option if you get there. And the Head of the Eternal doesn't synergize with your commander, but it's just a great card to include because it has 4 power. And then if you can somehow do damage pre-combat, you can get a lot of mana for your second main phase. Leyline Tyrant's a 4/4 that flies, which is the bar for this deck. But then on top of that, it has the extra ability where you can store extra mana to pop someone for a lot of damage later on. Helena Kessig Trapper adds an amount of red with the greatest power creatures you control that enter the battlefield, which in this case will almost always be 4 or more, which is like 80% of casting your commander. Defiler of Instinct is nice because it lets you reduce the cost of your spells, which aren't always super cheap, usually 3 to 4 mana minimum, and reducing the mana greatly accelerates your game plan. On top of that, it does damage to small creatures or your opponent's faces, and it's got 4 power, which is previously stated the bar. Sword of Hearth and Home lets you flicker your commander to reuse that ETB, which again is the bread and butter of this deck. It also ramps you for basic mountains that come in untapped, which is nice. Carnelian Orb Dragon Pine gives your commander haste and adds mana. And when you get to enter and attack in the same turn, you will just do completely absurd amounts of damage, and your opponents won't know what hit them. Dragon Sword is nice because it's a 3 mana, but then later on you can remove gold counters from which your dragons will give it to draw cards, which your deck desperately needs in mono red. Last, but certainly not least for ramp, is Descent into Avernus. If you have not played with this card, I strongly recommend just finding a home for it. The card does damage, it ramps you, but especially in your very burn-heavy focused decks, this is going to just accelerate your game plan, both in that you're casting your spells faster, but also the clock is just so quick. By the third turn, Descent into Avernus makes its way back around. You've added 12 mana and dealt 12 damage each opponent. They've ramped too, but our deck is designed to kill them as fast as we possibly can, so it'll help us more than it will help them. Now let's get into the meat of the deck, generic red 4/4s. First, we got Obsidian Charmaw. Its cost gets reduced, which is nice, and then it can blow up an opponent's land. Atsushi the Blazing Sky flies, it tramples. When it dies, you can exile cards or make treasures. Alexios, Demos of Cosmos, is just a slicer variant that starts with 4 power and just makes its way around the table, getting bigger and damaging opponents. Thunderbreak Regent is a dragon. It also flies, and when they target your commander, which they will, they'll take 3 damage as well. Cleric's Bladewing is a 4/4 flyer for 4, but it's also 2 4/4 flyers for 7. Torian Mauler gets absolutely massive. It's also a dragon, and by the second spell, so probably your next go around, it'll be 4 power. Veteran Brawler is an old card that's actually really bad, but it's a 4/4 in stats, and it's only 2 mana. You don't plan to attack with it, it just needs to be on the battlefield. Lupine Prototype is possibly even worse. It can't attack or block unless an opponent has no cards in hand, but again, it's got that juicy 5/5 power, and for only 2 mana. Slumbering Cerberus is the best of the worst 4 power for 2 mana creatures. It doesn't untap, but at least it's a 4/2 guard dog that just sits there. Giant Cindermaw and Cyclops Raptor are power crept new red 3 mana 4/3s. Cindermaw has trample and nobody can gain life, which is important because we are trying to reduce life, not gain it. Cyclops Raptor is also nice because if someone tries to mess with their game plan, be it counterspell or removal, they will take 4 damage if it's during our turn, or even another opponent's turn. Another damage creature, which you guys actually saw in the episode, hopefully, was Gimli Counter Kills. Has trample, it's a 4/3, and then additionally, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, it deals 1 damage to the controller, which will help us do even more damage. Our creatures are generally pretty big and warrant jump blocks. Emerald Hellion is nice. It's a 4/5 trample for 5, but the more important line of text is that if another red source would deal damage to a permanent player, it deals that much damage +1, which again would trigger for every single one of Dragonhawk's damages. Sunspine Lynx, another life gain hoser, also stops damage prevention. It's a 5/4 for 4, which is again very pushed. But then additionally, it's got Price of Progress on that body, which you could flicker with something like Sword of Hearth at Home. Price of Progress itself is also an excellent card. Definitely goes in the deck. It just does so much damage. Another good card is Clelia the Blader Forge. She attacks and lets us get more cards for that turn only, but our deck really needs card draw. And then she grows if we play the cards from herself or Dragonhawk, or also Furious Rise, which is a card that lets us exile our top card if we control a creature with power 4 greater, which we almost always should, and lets us get card advantage. Ox of Agonis is the last of our actual card draw. Then we also have Urabrask Heretic Praetor. It both gives us exile-based card draw during our upkeep, and also hoses our opponent's first draw. They have to cast it that turn and gets exile. Notably also 4 power, you may detect a theme here. Tiamat's Fanatics is nice because it's got haste. It's a 4 power dragon, but that Myriad trigger we can stack so that the Myriad trigger happens first, and then our commander's attack trigger happens, meaning it sees all 3 bodies. Wrathful Red Dragon is nice because it's a 5 power flying dragon, but then it also lets our dragons redirect damage they would take to any target that's not a dragon, including if we play a card in our deck called Blasphemous Act. Iraxa, Empress of Mars, is a 5/4. It's one of the few Doctor Who cards. It doesn't look super Doctor Who, which is kind of nice for me. I'm not a huge fan. But it's got Trample and Battlecry, which is nice. And then if we cast it from exile, we make it 2/2, which goes wide. War Beast of Gorgoroth is another new card that adds resilience from Lord of the Rings. It's a 5/4, and whenever it or another creature with power 4 greater dies, you can amass Orcs 2, which if 2 creatures die, you've already got another 4 power creature. Anax Harden the Forge is also a 3-drop that has star power, which in this case will almost always be 4 because it's the Ocean of Red, which is going to be huge. And then if it or another non-token creature dies, if they have power 4 greater, which they should, I make 2 1/1 Satyrs. Frenzied Saddleroot's nice because it's a 5/4 with haste on its own, but then it also gives all other creatures attacking your opponents and planeswalkers haste, which means your opponents can attack each other, but they can't attack you, and Dragonhawk can attack immediately. So now we've reached the limited interaction the deck has. Vintage Classic Flame Tongue Kabu. It does 4 damage to target creature. It's also got 4 power. Bone Crusher Giant has the Stomp Adventure. It's a 2-drop you can actually cast, and it's a 4/3 that if they target it, it deals 2 damage to them. There are a couple ways to reduce Chandra's Incinerator's cost down. And when you do, it's a 6/6 trampler for as little as 1 red mana. But then, even more importantly, at the end of your turn, when your commander's damage triggers, you have a bunch of individual damage triggers to send and just nuke the opponent's board. Invasion of Karsus is a 4 mana, 3 damage wrath for creatures and planeswalkers. But the flip side is a 4/4 with Ward, pay 2 life, and whenever you cast a spell, it domes each opponent for 2, which is very much in line with their game plan, both being a 4/4 and a damage outlet all in one. Manic Amogus is exactly what the deck wants to be doing. It comes in and just domes your opponents for how much red devotion you have, which is almost every creature in your deck. Rising of the Day is a nice haste enabler, but also pumps your legendary creatures, which is a good chunk of this deck. So you just get extra damage on attacks. And then we get some more expensive creatures, which are kind of optional, but also very good. First, we have Avatar of Fury. If an opponent controls 7 or more lands, it costs 6 less to cast, so it can cost as little as 2 red. It's a flyer. It also has fire breathing, but when you play a green player, casting this for 2 feels really nice, and when you hit in the air, it feels even nicer. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs is a 5/4 that will help reduce some of the damage coming our way, because unless an opponent pays 3, we get a 3/3. Seize the Day is often win war in some decks, but we only need our commander to attack, and if it attacks 3 times in one turn, the game is probably going to end. Now, the budget for these cards is 20% of the deck, but they're just so good, it's very hard not to include them. Perforos is indestructible, so you probably won't lose it. It'll almost always be turned on as a creature once you have creatures out, and then it just makes our damage triggers happen even more often. Every time a creature comes in, we're doing 2 more damage to the opponents, and all these chunks will really start to add up. Roaming Throne doubles your commander's trigger. It's also a 4/4. It's got Ward. You know this card is good. And lastly, Sulphine Mayhem Dominus. It doubles your damage from sources you control, which is invaluable. Lastly, you have Hellkite Courser, which will enter and let your commander enter, and then also attack in the same turn, then bounce to your hand to enter again, without actually messing with commander attacks to give you 3 triggers minimum, on top of the 6/5 body that comes with. Let's talk about lands. I mentioned before that haste is a huge boon to this deck and the commander, so you're running every haste land you can. That includes Arena of Glory, Hummer Battlements, and Hall of the Bandit Lord. You need your commander to attack as soon as possible to get the extra trigger. I'm of the firm opinion that every deck should run all the MDFCs it can, so you're also running a Coom Warrior, which is the 4/5 trample, but also a land, and Sudden Eruption, which will stop your opponents from blocking your grounded attackers. It also means that even reach creatures cannot block your flyers, and then less relevantly, it blows up a land, but you really want the stopping blocks mode of this card. You also have War Room for card draw, Command Beacon to connect your commander, Myriad Landscape to ramp you, Seken's Crucible Defense, War of Mine to have blocker, rounded out by as many mountains as will fit in the deck. That's just about the entire rundown of my personal Dragonhawk deck list. This is an insanely fun commander, and I promise if you build this deck, you won't sit down for 3-hour games wondering why your parents didn't try harder to force you into sports as a kid. If you like the deck tech, like and subscribe to my channel on YouTube for more videos on Commander. I'm S. Freezy, and my channel is Commander Wendy's.